Previously in this series on Chapter 13, in video 41, we covered how the Counter-Reformation is openly and intentionally hiding the fact that over 60% of Revelation 13 describes traits of an absolute monarchy, and there is only one place on earth that matches those descriptions, and that is Vatican City, Rome. In video 42, we examined the original language of the Textus Receptus, and discovered it describes such things as thrones, preaching, assemblies, religious icons, and a substitute crucifixion, which the people would worship and adore, and which John found particularly distasteful and offensive, as reflected in his language about it. And you saw that translators glossed over these references, picking definitions on the lexicon list that were not only inconsistent with the text, but were third and fourth, secondary meanings and definitions, way down on the list of possible meanings. And these selections were being made as a result of theological evasion tactics in the language. In video 43, we examined the time frame for John's first prophecy, and discovered it covered the period of history from the rise of Constantine in Rome, to the establishment of the new Roman theocracy. In video 44, we covered the prophecies in verses 1 through 6, concerning the giving of the throne by the Roman Emperor Constantine, to the creation of a new absolute monarchy, known today as the Roman papacy. We discovered John prophesied a mouthpiece for this monarchy would come, and was fulfilled in John Chrysostom, whose last name, literally was an honorific name, meaning, the golden-mouthed, and was responsible for institutionalizing a genocidal hatred of Jews, and the establishment of the compulsory practice of Christmas, claiming that the pagan Roman Caesar himself had been inspired by God in its creation, and which would last 4 centuries to come. In video 45, we discovered the fulfillment of John's prophecy about the word proskuneo, and how the Roman religious monarch, which John had prophesied, would be kissed, as a dog licks his master's hand. And how John's prophecy about the violent nature of this absolute monarchy was fulfilled in the riots of Alexandria, which literally ushered in the Dark Ages in Western society. In this video, we will examine exegetically the verses in the text of the second prophecy, from verse 11 to verse 18, and we will also examine these verses for astronomical references, and construct our historical timeline for the amazing fulfillment of the second prophecy in history. You will also find out what the Counter-Reformation has been hiding from the world, concerning the mark of the beast, the image of the beast, and the infamous 666. References that get turned into fictitious hoaxes to malign anything a counter-reformationist preacher personally doesn't like, from vaccinations to any advanced technology, and from rock musicians to secular presidents in another political party they don't like. All the while intentionally obfuscating and lying to the public about what is actually in the texts of Revelation 13. You are about to discover what they have been busy hiding from you, and why. We are now ready to examine John's second prophecy in chapter 13. It consists of 8 verses, from verse 11 to verse 18, which ends the chapter with a prophecy about 666. This prophecy is the most propagandized and obfuscated prophecy in the entire book of Revelation, with the only close possible exception being chapter 9. The reason, of course, that it is so intentionally obfuscated is because of how devastating its real contents are to the dominant church-state religious system in Western society. So millions of dollars are constantly being pumped into smothering the contents of this chapter. It is devastating once it is seen. The reason this text is so devastating is because it is so obvious in terms of its fulfillment. If you see the text for what it is, there will be very little doubt as to how it was fulfilled in history, and that is precisely why it must be explained away, or simply hidden. But rather than hide the text, as most sources on the internet, or on TV, will be trying to do, we will be exposing the text to the public as it is, directly from the Textus Receptus. So that rather than obfuscate these texts, we will be looking directly at them, to see what they are really saying, without censorship or theological filters. Verse 11 reads as follows, quote, "And I saw another beast arise out of the land, having 2 horns like a lamb, but preaching as a dragon." End quote. There are 4 keywords in the verse: beast, land, lamb, and dragon. All four of these terms are normally deflected and obfuscated. John says he sees another beast. As you remember from previous videos, the term beast refers to a kingdom, not simply a single person. Counter-reformationist preachers always make the term beast refer to a single person, because in both prophecies in chapter 13, they are hiding the fact John is prophesying about the rise of a new Roman monarchy. John's second prophecy begins by describing the rise of another religious authority in the East. And this is reiterated by John when he also says he has two horns like a lamb, but preaches as a dragon. Dragon being the previous reference to the Roman Empire. And John is identifying this beast in verse 11 by noting the content of what it is preaching. Preaching is a religious activity, and this is a religious monarchy. This is another kingdom that is related to the Roman Empire, and it is also related to the previous absolute monarchy described in verses 1 through 10. But this beast, or kingdom, is a little different from the first one, as John will explain in a moment. The reference to the phrase, quote, like a lamb, and the word, preaching, also tells us that like the previous absolute monarchy, John is describing something that is both religious and takes the appearance of Christ or Christianity, but in reality, is once again an extension or creation of the Roman Empire. The dragon. John also notes this kingdom arises out of the land. The first kingdom arose out of the sea. So there is a contrast between land and sea. It is not controversial, and virtually everyone agrees, that the sea refers to the Gentiles, meaning the Roman Empire based in the city of Rome, and the land refers to the land of Israel, based in the city of Jerusalem. The obvious geographical locations of Rome being the western location, and Jerusalem being the eastern. This point is usually admitted by counter-reformationists, because it gives them a basis to indict the Jews in the plot. And it serves as a springboard for Jewish conspiracy theories and the Antichrist taking over the world. But as you will see, in the historical fulfillment, although the second kingdom does arise out of the land, meaning Jerusalem, it is far from anything Jewish, precisely as John prophesies, connecting it directly to the dragon, meaning the Roman Empire. So John is prophesying the rise of a second kingdom in the East, involving Jerusalem. John says it has two horns like a lamb, which is a reference to Christianity or Christ, but will preach like the dragon, which is Imperial Rome. So it has the appearance of Christianity, but its Christianity is really just a veneer for the Roman Empire. John's descriptive of the term lamb clearly makes this a religious reference. John is prophesying the rise of a second religious authority in the East, connected to Jerusalem. It is a monarchy. It is religious in nature. And it arises from the Middle East, the Holy Land, and includes Jerusalem in particular. These are the facts from verse 11. There are nothing in these texts about atheists, Jews, communists, liberals, secular humanists, Muslims, aliens, the Trilateral Commission, the Illuminati, the medical establishment, or any of the other nonsense garbage counter-reformationist liars peddle on the internet to victimize people with. John is prophesying the rise of another religious authority in the East. And he is going to give some amazing details in the following verses about this religious authority and what it is going to do. In verse 12, we read the following, quote, "And the authority of the former beast he does, all in the face of him, and makes the residents of the land to reverence the former beast, whose stroke of death was adored." End quote. In verse 12, John gives two prophetic statements, which begin describing what the Eastern monarch will do. First, John states that he exercises the authority of the first beast. Not meaning he exercises authority like the first beast, but that the authority he exercises actually comes from the first beast, or monarchy. Secondly, John states that he uses that authority to make the residents of the land reverence the first beast, or monarchy. And then John adds the additional statement, quote, "whose stroke of death was adored." End quote. Which, as you remember from the previous video, this was a reference to the creation of the practice called the adoration of the crucifixion. So John connects the rise of this monarch to the events in the first prophecy, which led to the adoration of the false, or substitute, crucifixion, by Rome. That is an amazingly specific prophecy. By including that last phrase, John is connecting what he is about to prophesy to the city of Jerusalem, and to the very location where this alleged cross was found, and to the very people involved in that event. So John is getting very specific, both in terms of identity and geography, as he begins to describe who and what the second beast, or monarch, will be. In verse 13, we read, quote, "And he does great miracles and makes fire come down from heaven in the land, in the sight of men." End quote. Because counter-reformationist rapture preachers are peddling lies, they have to make up stuff to fill in these verses. They know their false narratives will never match this text, so they come up with silly explanations such as this verse refers to a secular president ordering a modern drone strike, and thus will be fulfilled by a modern secular president. But, no. Only, if you pay no attention to what the text actually says, and once again, use it as an ink blot for your free associations. The text describes what is seen by men as a great miracle, meaning something unusual. Normally, what people consider to be supernatural, or anomalous, in nature. Not a drone strike, which is not miraculous. We have a very simple, clear, and very obvious prophecy that the second religious authority in Jerusalem will produce miracles, one of which John specifies as fire from heaven. The fire appears miraculously in Jerusalem, and this miracle is attributed to heaven as its source. That is a very obvious thing. You can't possibly hide or obfuscate the existence of this prophetic sign. Once you see it, you can never unsee it. It is not symbolic. It is not metaphorical. It is not something else. It is precisely as you read it here, fire from heaven, in the form of a miracle. But John has something else to say about this alleged miracle, done in Jerusalem, by this Eastern religious authority, who works for the Roman Empire, in the very next verse. It is a very important detail, he adds in verse 14, about this miracle. Verse 14 reads as follows, quote, "And he deceives the residents of the land through the miracle that he gives to them, in the face of the beast, preaching to the residents of the land, make an icon of the beast, that had the stroke of the sword and lived." End quote. This is a very long verse, and contains a lot of prophetic information. So we will break each section down, and look at what they mean. There are 7 sections of text in this one verse. So we will label each section alphabetically, and examine their content. Verse 14. A. He deceives the residents of the land. Verse 14. B. Through the miracle that he gives to them. Verse 14. C. In the face of the beast. Verse 14. D. Preaching to the residents of the land. Verse 14. E. Make an icon. Verse 14. F. Of the beast. Verse 14. G. That had the stroke of the sword and lived. In section 14, A and B, John tells his readers, this miracle is actually going to be a deception. John doesn't specify in detail how this alleged miracle is going to be a deception, only that it will be a deception. There is fraud involved in the production and meaning of this miracle. So John is actually prophesying the production of a fraudulent miracle. In section 14, C, John states it will be, quote, in the face of the beast, meaning under the authority of the first beast, which is the Roman absolute monarchy, which John prophesies in verses 1 through 10. In section 14, D, John states, quote, preaching to the residents of the land, end quote. So this is a religious figure, whose activity is preaching, and he is located in Jerusalem, and his audience are its residents. Which is a very important detail, because John does not identify these residents as Jews, but only as residents. using the same kind of language we saw in chapter 11. These are the residents, the people who currently reside there. Not Jews. In section 14e, John writes the phrase, quote, make an icon, end quote. John states that this Eastern religious authority will authorize and instruct icon worship. This is an amazingly specific prophecy, because icons are a specific thing, and for this to be done in the Middle East would be an astounding development, because this was not part of the world where this practice was widely observed. Idolatry usually involved the production of statues, not icons. And Messianic Jews, as recorded in the New Testament, in Acts chapter 7, verse 43, rejected even symbolic art in their worship. So icon worship would represent a very distinct and noticeable change in religious practice. In section 14f, John attributes the target of this iconography to be, not Christ, but the beast. Once again, meaning the Roman monarch, described in verses 1 through 10. And in the last section, 14g, John introduces a curious new phrase. This time he does not use his previous phrase, quote, the beast whose stroke is adored. Instead, he states, quote, the beast who had the stroke of the sword and did live. End quote. This is different language. John's language has changed. Why the change in language, and what was John prophesying? Here, John is emphasizing resurrection. John is telling us this fraudulent miracle, connected to the adoration of the crucifix, introduced in verse 3, will be done at what is known today as Easter. So John has given us the location, the event, and the time, and even the religious practices it will be associated with, when this fraudulent miracle will be performed by the second beast. So there is very little excuse for failing to see it, or confusing it for anything else in history. John prophesies it will be in Jerusalem. John prophesies it will be associated with icon worship. John prophesies it will be associated with miraculous fire from heaven. John prophesies, however, it will be a fraud, or a deception. John prophesies it will be done by the Eastern religious authority. And John prophesies it will be done at Easter. There is not much left that John has not prophesied about this event. And why does John use the curious expression, quote, who had the stroke of the sword and lived? End quote. It was a prophetic insult, once again. John is saying prophetically again, that they are not worshiping Christ, they are worshiping themselves. And this phrase will be fully explained when we get to the historical fulfillment of these events. You will be utterly amazed at how detailed and specific John's prophecies were in this text, to the extent there is no honest way they could be missed, or confused for anything else. Verse 15 reads as follows, quote, and he gave of himself a powerful spirit to the icon of the beast, so that the icon of the beast even speaks, and he makes whoever does not reverence the icon of the beast to be put to death. End quote. In verse 15, John says this practice of icon worship will not only become widely accepted because of the work of this Eastern religious Roman monarch, but it will grow in power until it is literally codified into the empire's state law, even to the extreme of capital punishment. John explains, the way this will happen is that a spirit will be attributed to the icon, so that it will evidence signs of life. John specifically states that people will even claim it speaks to them. In verse 13, John mentions miracles, plural. Then John specifies the miracle, fire from heaven. Then he mentions icon worship. So John is not limiting the miracles to just the fraudulent miraculous fire from heaven, or the icon displaying signs of life, but John makes it clear that these miracles are all conducted in relationship to icon worship, and specifically an icon of a false Christ, which seduces people in the Middle East, cited specifically as residents of the land, into the worship of them. And then, in the second part of the verse, John prophesies, all these events will lead to religious compulsion, and people will be forced to reverence the icon, whether they agree with it or not, or they will face capital punishment. In essence, John is prophesying, along with this new icon worship, will emerge new religious compulsion laws. An icon which shows signs of life, and is capable of causing people to hear it speak, is hardly an event anyone could honestly miss or confuse for something else. If this happened, you would surely see it and know this prophecy has been fulfilled. And that is precisely what the prophecy states will happen. Verse 16 reads as follows. Quote, "And he makes all, the small and the great, the rich and the poor, the free and the slave, to receive his mark upon their right forehand or upon their forehead." End quote. This is the famous text quoted about the mark of the beast. There are 4 deceptions, being intentionally spread by counter-reformationists, to hide and obfuscate John's prophecy in this verse. This is another text counter-reformationists will bend over backwards to keep anyone from seeing this text. Their deception comes in the form of 4 simple corruptions of the text. First, they will use the term, all, in the text, to mean every single last person on the entire planet Earth, without any single exception. They insist on using the term, all, in an absolute quantitative sense. They will change the biblical use of this term. Secondly, they will intentionally corrupt and hide the stated location of the mark in the text. They will offer pretty much any location anywhere, except where it says. Thirdly, they will intentionally corrupt the term, mark, itself, into just about anything on earth, other than a mark. A mark is the one thing counter-reformationists do not want you to see in that text. They want you to see an ink blot instead. Fourthly, they will claim that their ink blot association taken from the word, mark, controls all buying and selling in the world. And therefore whatever has happened in history is not the mark, because the mark is a modern technology that controls all buying and selling. It is sort of a circular reasoning argument. As you will see, all 4 of those claims are patently false. And once again, you are left with only 2 options to explain these claims. Either are so stupid, they never bother to read the text for themselves, or they are intentionally lying about it. But no third option is really available as an explanation. So let's begin with the first lie they spread. That being how they contort the word, all. The word, all, in that text, is the Greek qualitative use, meaning, all kinds, not the quantitative use, which means every single last one. The phrase, all men, which is used in the KJV 62 times in the New Testament, as you see on your screen, almost virtually never refers to every single last man on planet Earth. For example, 3 John chapter 1 verse 12 says Demetrius has good report of all men. That obviously could not refer to every single person on planet Earth, because not all men, in that sense of the word, ever knew who Demetrius even was. The largest population on planet Earth stretching back for millennia has been Asia, where both the modern countries of India and China exist. No one in the ancient lands of China or India had ever even heard of Paul's Demetrius. Yet Paul uses the expression, all men. This is the same use of the Greek qualitative sense that is used in the famous text in 1 Timothy chapter 6 verse 10, where Paul writes that money is the root of all evil. The term all, used in that text, is the qualitative use of the Greek and means all kinds. Obviously it would be impossible for money to be the root of every single last evil. There was no money in heaven when Satan rebelled. Nor was there any money in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve ate the fruit of the tree of knowledge. So, Paul did not mean every single last evil, he meant evil of every kind. He was using the Greek qualitative use of the term. John is also using the Greek qualitative sense, which means all kinds, and which he explicitly states in the parenthetical statement that follows, writing, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave. They all take the mark, meaning all kinds. Not every single last person on earth, but all, as in, all kinds of people, every kind of person, no matter who they are. John specifies in the text itself, he means the qualitative sense, as in every kind. Because he lists the kinds he means in the text, immediately following his use of the term. So next time you see a counter-reformationist preacher yell the word, all, and claim everyone on earth is going to get the mark, you need to walk away. because you are listening to someone who is either so ignorant they shouldn't be teaching anyone, or is simply intentionally deceiving people, despite what they know is really in the language. John states they receive this mark upon the right forehand, or upon their head. John gives 3 definitive locations in this statement: the right forehand or the forehead, and upon the surface of the skin. He didn't say on the bottom of the foot, or on your teeth, or on your shoulder, or arm, or back, or chest, or leg. He said forehead and right forehand. And that is as specific as it can get. And he said on, as in upon. Not around, through, or inside of. So, if for example, you hear counter-reformationist preachers blabbing about vaccinations being the mark of the beast, you can, once again, know for a fact, you're listening to a liar. There are 3 specific locations given for the mark John is prophesying about: the forehead, the right forehand, and on the surface of the skin. If it doesn't match those 3 specific locations, whatever else someone may be talking about, it is not what John was prophesying. And if they attribute their false claims to him, then they are either mistaken because of misinformation or ignorance, or they are simply intentionally publicly lying. John's use of the Greek term, epi, means upon. Not in. Not under. But upon. That is a very specific reference. The Greek term epi means, on the surface of. The Greek word epi is where we get our word epidermis. The epidermis is the outer layer of skin. John's reference is to the surface of the skin. Not an implant, a microchip, a vaccination, or an RFD chip, all of which go into and under the skin. None of which are upon, as the Greek word epi indicates in John's statement. You don't get COVID vaccinations in your forehand or forehead. The third corruption taught by counter-reformationists concerns the word mark. This is not complicated. The word mark means a mark. It doesn't mean 50 other things. It isn't metaphorical, imaginary, invisible, pretend, or just symbolic. John is prophesying a real mark, and that is why he gives specific details about where it is placed on the real body. When you hear counter-reformationist preachers trying to obfuscate and morph this term into 50 other things, you need to realize there is no ambiguity about the word mark. A mark is what a mark is. On your screen is a parallel view of 8 major translations ranging through history, from the Geneva Bible up to our modern day. They all consistently translate this word into English as the word mark. The only exception you will find, oddly, all by itself, is the Douay-Rheims Bible, which is the Catholic translation. It translates the Greek into the word character, rather than mark. It is the only one that does that. And there is a reason that the Catholic Bible is the only translation that intentionally avoids the word mark, even though that is precisely what the Greek term means. There is a reason. It is the Catholic Bible alone that avoids that term. And you will see in a moment precisely what that reason is. But despite Catholicism's attempt to obfuscate the text, a mark is still also a character. But the choice of that term character is an obvious attempt to make something fuzzy where it is not. In case you don't know what a mark is, this is the definition of the word mark. Definition 3C of Merriam-Webster's online dictionary defines a mark to be a cross made in place of a signature. Cambridge Dictionary says it is illustrated in the phrase X marks the spot. Dictionary.com states it is to mark, as in, put an X on each box. TheFreeDictionary.com states in definition 2C, it is a sign, such as a cross. In case you do not know what a mark even looks like, this is actually a picture of a mark. You are now looking at what a mark actually looks like on your screen. Marks can be drawn diagonally, or they can be drawn vertically. And this is a picture of a mark on a forehead. This is the picture of a mark on a forehand. So when you hear a counter-reformationist rapture preacher quote this text about a mark, and then hold up a picture of something else, other than a mark, you now know he has literally entirely ignored what John prophesied. So there is no point in listening to anything else he has to say. He is simply fantasizing and inventing things. John wrote that it would be a mark, not a microchip. The English word micro, as in microchip, is from the Greek word mikros, which is actually used in the New Testament. If John wanted to have said a microchip, there was actually language in the New Testament he could have, and would have, used, to say it. But he didn't, because that is not what he meant. He meant the word mark, and that is what he wrote. Microchips are not marks. They are microchips. Counter-reformationist liars who quote this text, and hold up a picture of a microchip, are simply open public bold-faced liars. Most of the time, they are intentionally lying, liars. They know perfectly well that description does not match what John wrote, but they will intentionally spread that filthy disinformation, because it serves their political purposes to do so. They are damned liars, in the full theological sense of that term. The utter blasphemous and dangerous filth the Counter-Reformation uses to excuse and hide itself is in many ways absolutely criminal. For example, telling the public that COVID vaccinations are the mark of the beast, so that people will literally choose to die before they will get a COVID vaccine. That is criminal behavior. That is literally killing people. The COVID vaccine is not the mark of the beast, and there is absolutely no ambiguity about that at all. You don't get COVID vaccinations in your forehead, or on the back of your hand. When is the last time anyone went to the doctor and got a COVID vaccination in the middle of their forehead? It would be very painful, and a ridiculous place to get a vaccine, because there is nothing there, under the skin, but bone. All these false explanations concerning the mark of the beast, that it is a COVID vaccination or an RFD chip or a processing microchip, come from ignorance, deceit, and from open, willful rebellion against God. Those explanations are not in this text. They are not even remotely close to what John wrote in this text. The mark John is referring to is the same mark that was placed on the apostasy goat, which was thrown over the cliff on the Day of Atonement. It was a mark made with ash. It is an ash mark placed on the forehead of the goat to signify that it was destined for destruction. And that is its significance here, and that is the mark John is making reference to. You can't miss it. It is not hidden. It is not a mystery. It is not some futuristic thing you have to figure out. It is done in plain view, right in front of the whole world. And John describes what it is perfectly, without any ambiguity whatsoever. If you don't want to accept what he wrote, then you should be honest enough to simply say so. Counter-Reformationist preachers try to turn John into a sock puppet for their own lies. But John makes it perfectly clear. The mark of the beast is a mark placed on the surface of the skin, located on the forehead, or the right forehand, precisely as he described it. End of story. It is not metaphorical. It is literal, and it is real. The last lie that counter-reformationist preachers tell the world is that this mark, which in the text is nothing more than a mark precisely as John describes, controls all the buying and selling in the world. Therefore the mark must be some form of technology. But that claim on close inspection in the actual text also falls completely apart. The text John wrote absolutely says no such thing. In fact, what he wrote openly contradicts that claim. It does not control all buying and selling, as counter-reformationist preachers insist, as you will clearly see in the next verse. Next time you see a counter-reformationist liar quote verse 16 about a mark, if he holds up anything other than a mark, such as a vaccine, a bruise, a bump, a logo, or a microchip, you can turn him off right then and there. Because he is being a bold-faced liar concerning this text. A mark is a mark, and nothing else. If it isn't a mark, it has nothing to do with what John prophesied in this text. Any more than light bulbs, microwave ovens, race cars, video games, banana pudding or spaceships. Do not let counter-reformationist liars give you a ridiculous list of completely unrelated things and call it the mark of the beast. If anyone does that to you, correct them and leave. You're listening to a false teacher at best, and more likely than not, an intentional liar. In verse 17, we read, Quote, "And no one is allowed to market or trade, if they do not have the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name." End quote. In the King James translation of this text, there are 26 words. But you would never know that, if you listen to the preaching of counter-reformationist, rapture preachers. They will have you convinced, that in the KJV text, there are only 14 words in the verse. Because they stop, literally halfway through the verse. They ignore almost 50% of the rest of the text. Why would anyone who spends their entire life, studying and preaching biblical texts, intentionally ignore an entire 50% of a verse? Maybe because they are very lazy, and reading the remaining 50% of the verse is just too much work? Or maybe they can't really read? Maybe someone is reading for them, and the person who is reading for them never read the rest of the verse to them? That is obviously very unlikely. So what explains the inability of counter-reformation, rapture, preachers, to read the remaining 50% of the verse they always constantly and continuously ignore? How do you explain a preacher who does that? On purpose? Because that is precisely what they do when it comes to verse 17. They read only 14 words of a verse that is 26 words long. The part they read goes like this. Quote, "And that no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark." End quote. That is the end of the verse as far as counter-reformation rapture preachers are concerned. And then if it is not enough that they chop off the second half of the verse, they actually add to the little snippet of the verse they decided to read. And they add that, therefore, since no one is allowed to buy or sell without the mark, that means the mark is what is controlling who buys and sells. You need it to do any buying and selling. Of course, the text does not say that, but if you have an audience of lazy pseudo-Christians, who's going to care anyway? You can pretty much tell them anything anyway, as long as you stand in their multi-million-dollar pulpit when you do it. They're just there for the music and the pretty building, anyway. Right? But the part they read is not the whole verse. And the part they leave out is the part that changes everything. And that is precisely why they leave it out. They have to. The rest of the verse says, quote, "Or the name of the beast, or the number of his name." End quote. The word "or" appears twice in the remainder of the verse. They are connectors, and actually go with the first part of the verse that says, quote, "Save he that had the mark." End quote. So in other words, it goes like this, quote, "Save he that had the mark," or "the name of the beast," or "the number of his name." If you can count, as well as read, then you will count 3 conditions. And these 3 conditions are not connected by the term "and." The term "and" means you have to add them all up together to meet the criteria of buying and selling. But the term that connects them is the word "or." "Or" means that any single one of the conditions meets the criteria for buying and selling. Not all 3 of them. That fact also means that you do not even have to have the mark to buy and sell. According to the rest of this text, that they intentionally do not read. You might have the name of the beast, but not the mark. Or, you might have the number of his name, but not the mark. There are 2 other entire categories of people, other than those that have the mark, that are allowed to buy and sell. So obviously and factually, this text is not saying only those who have the mark are able to buy and sell. That is just the factual grammar of the text. Anyone and everyone can clearly read what it says, if they can read. So why do counter-reformationists not want you to see that? And they really do not want you to see that. That is why they intentionally lump off the rest of the verse. Well, the reason they do not want you to see the rest of the verse is that they know it would expose them as liars. And that would be very embarrassing. Plus it would mess up what they are trying to do, which is make sure you have no clue what the mark of the beast really is. Otherwise, they would read the rest of the verse to you. But they don't, do they? And this is the famous buying and selling text. Counter-reformationist preachers do not bother to read what the text says. They see the word mark in verse 16, and the phrase buying and selling in verse 17, and that is the end of what they see. Nothing else counts. The actual text doesn't matter. They have the 2 most important parts of their ink blots, to begin their tirades of endless free associations. And that is all that matters. Secondly, what good is buying and selling, anyway, if the text says you will be killed, if you do not reverence the image, or icon of the beast, in verse 15. But for some very strange reason, the fact you would be already qualified for capital punishment, by refusing to reverence the icon, doesn't factor into their descriptions of the all-knowing, all-seeing, magic technology mark, that controls all buying and selling. They really love fear-mongering people with technophobia. And their false citations of the phrase, mark of the beast. They absolutely love it. Despite the fact, it is a completely and totally false claim. John is prophesying that even if you manage to somehow escape religious persecution during this time, you won't be able to market or trade anything. You will be without any way to make a living, or provide food for your family. And as you will soon see, that is precisely what happened in history. This is a very clear text because of John's use of the word, or, connecting the three criteria. If someone prophesied, a robber will come to your house Thursday night, and he will have a red shirt, or a green shirt or a yellow shirt, and he shows up with a green shirt, you wouldn't claim the prophecy was never fulfilled because he only had a green shirt on. Because the prophecy said a red shirt, or a green shirt, or a yellow shirt. It did not specify only one color. It specified three possibilities. Any one of three would match what was prophesied. And that is exactly what John prophesied in verse 17. He did not prophesy there would be a mark that controlled buying and selling, and everyone in the world would have to take it. That is factually and grammatically simply not in the text in Revelation chapter 13. Why would John write a prophecy that way? Because of two very obvious reasons. One is that the legal requirements may have been fluid. They may have been evolving and changing in the legal code. But every condition, without exception, was an overt submission to the Roman absolute monarchy. The second reason is to make it obvious. While you may be able to wiggle your way out of one description, or maybe even two descriptions, it is very unlikely you are going to wiggle your way out of three, all at the same time. So John is attempting to write a very broad encompassing prophecy that leaves very little wiggle room for denials. The text does not simply say, there is no buying and selling without the mark of the beast. It says, the mark of the beast, or his name, or the number of his name. So there are three things. Not one. Any one of those three things fulfill the conditions of buying and selling, and also consequently, by the way, fulfill the conditions of John's prophecy. You know already what the mark is. The phrase, his name, in this verse, is a prophetic reference to the literal actual official name that will actually be legally required, precisely as John is prophesying here. And the number of his name, in this verse, is a reference to being found among the assembly of the beast, John mentions in verse 10. The biblical usage of the phrase, number, used the word number to refer to describing members of a group, as in the number of disciples, or the number of believers, or the number of the tribe of Judah. The number of his name means the number of people belonging to the assembly John describes in verse 10. The real prophecy given by John in verse 17 is that the absolute monarchy created by the Roman Empire would control buying and selling, and require one of these three conditions: receiving the mark, receiving the name, or being found among his assembly. Any one of those three conditions fulfilled John's prophecy in verse 17. And finally, verse 18 reads as follows, quote, "In this is wisdom. The one that has understanding will use parables to enumerate the number of the beast. It is the number of a man. And his number is 666. End quote. As you are about to see in this final text of chapter 13, counter-reformationist ministers are either incredibly ignorant, they really shouldn't be teaching anyone, or they are unbelievably deceitful. But in either case, if you have been listening to the teaching or preaching of a counter-reformationist on the book of Revelation, they have done nothing for you, but completely hide what is in its texts, and misinform you with not only completely fictitious but even potentially dangerous garbage. Counter-reformationists will come up with every excuse in the book to hide the content and meaning of verse 18. They will even resort to completely denying it's even 666. The fact, the text really does specify 666, has been literally universally known, without controversy, for nearly 2 millennia. And when you hear counter-reformationists attempting to suppress it or hide, the first question you should really ask yourself is, why? Why would they want to hide this? And make it go away? Because there is a very, very big reason. As you will see in just a moment. This prophecy is an absolutely obvious prophecy, if you look at it from an historical perspective. You see exactly and precisely what John prophesied, and it will be absolutely crystal clear, and unmistakable. And that is precisely why the Counter-Reformation never wants you to see it that way. They will take it anyway, but the way it is prophesied, because they already know the consequences, if you read John's prophecy, just like you do every other prophecy in the Bible. And that is why they work so hard to hide what John has written. With verse 18, John ends his prophecies in chapter 13. This last text is the punchline of his prophecy. He saves the most powerful line in his 2 prophecies for the very last verse. Verses 17 and 18 also indicate a break in subject matter from the previous verses. In verse 11, John introduces the second beast. In verse 12, John says, he does the authority of the first beast, stating, he. In verse 13, John states, he does miracles, and makes fire come from heaven, stating, he, again. In verse 14, John states, he deceives, by means of the fire, and seduces the people into icon worship, stating, he, again. In verse 15, John states he gives a spirit to the icon, stating, he. And in verse 16, John states, he makes. But when we get to verse 17 and verse 18, John switches his references. In verse 17, John refers to people in general. And in verse 18, John sums up the chapter with a prophecy concerning the identification of the beast. The whole beast. The entire monarchy he is prophesying. Both the western and eastern realms of it. And verse 18 is the conclusion, or punchline, of both prophecies and the chapter itself. It is a summary statement for the chapter. But verses 17 and 18 are no longer about the second beast. They are about the whole thing. The dragon, the beast and the second beast, all together. Verse 18 is intended to put the prophetic question of identification to rest. This will show you what the beast is, without ambiguity or doubt. And you will be able to know, even before it gets there, what it is. That is why John says to enumerate, not calculate. And why the Counter-Reformation always hides this fact. Because if they don't hide it, you will know as well. John repeats a phrase 3 times. The number of the beast. The number of a man. The number 666. So why does he do that? Counter-Reformationists have no clue. Or they cannot or will not tell you. They usually don't even mention it. And most of them have no clue what those 3 phrases refer to. It is a puzzle to them, if they are ever honest with the public they are deceiving. But it is not a puzzle to those with wisdom. It is known precisely why the repetition of 3 occurs in his statement. And then concludes with 3 sixes, each raised by a power of 10. 6, 60, and 600. Together they identify the beast. But there are 3 numbers. Not 1. There are 3 phrases. Not 1. And John doesn't tell anyone to calculate anything, he tells them to count. Counting is very simple. It is ordinal. First, second, third. There is nothing else you have to do. The first 6 is the number of the beast. The second 6, as in 60, is the number of a man. And the third 6, as in 600, is the final 6, and the completion of his reference to 666. John also states in verse 17, it is his name. What is a name? Well, that is extremely difficult for counter-reformationists to figure out. Generally, they have no clue what a name is. But for everyone else, it is pretty obvious what a name is. It is, wait for it, a name. A name is a name, just like a mark is a mark. So John is saying, This is also someone's name. It identifies the beast, meaning the absolute monarchy he is prophesying will come. The name itself. And it is to be counted, in an ordinal fashion, first, second, third, as on a list. Which is the definition of the word, enumerate. Which is what you are told to do. So John prophesies not just one name, by name, but 3 names, by name. 6 first, 6 second, and 6 third, which is 666. And that is why you enumerate the sixes, i.e., as count on a list. Not calculate anything. There is nothing here to calculate. John is not only literally giving the name, but even telling you how they will arise. In a succession. And that is what identifies the Roman absolute monarchy John is prophesying will come. And why would John identify them, in the 3 sentences that he does? The first 6, is the beast, John prophesies in verses 1 through 10. The second 6, is a man, he will be connected to the second prophecy in verses 11 through 16. And the third 6, is 666, by name, and will be the final confirmation this succession is really the beast, created by the dragon. There are actually 3 prophecies, involving 666, not just one. And the very first 6, is the beginning of the beast. Not the last 6. That is why the first phrase states, quote, the number of the beast. The number of the beast is obviously 6. The very first 6 is the beast, while it is coming. The second 6, as in 60, is the number of a man. The type of man that will be the ruler, and be given the throne of authority, from the dragon. This refers to the very prophecy John just gave in verses 11 through 16. It also has to do with the rise of the separate but subordinate Eastern religious monarchy. And the third 6, is the name, 666, or 63. Which is the final phase, or completion, of the rise of this Roman absolute monarchy. So you see, counter-reformation preachers are either oblivious to what is actually in this text, or they are simply too busy hiding it and deceiving people, to care. But they have not even scratched the surface of the prophecy, in verse 18. John is prophesying 3 sixes, not just one. An enumeration means to count each 6, in an ordinal fashion, 6th first, 6th second, 6th third. That is John's prophecy in verse 18. The number of the beast is 6. There is nothing to calculate. So next time you hear a counter-reformation rapture preacher spread out the quotation that John says to calculate something, so that they can take you somewhere else, you need to stop them right there, and walk away. Because whatever comes after that word, calculate, will be nothing more than a lie they will tell, to hide the truth from you. So John concludes his second prophecy describing the subordinate Eastern religious monarchy, and caps both prophecies off with a prophecy concerning a succession of 3 rulers by the name of 6, which will identify the beast, meaning the absolute monarch created by the Roman Empire. 6 first, 6 second and 6 third, also known as 666. That is why they will not acknowledge counter-reformationists, will never acknowledge what the text really instructs people to do, which is to enumerate, as in count in an ordinal fashion, first, second and third. Now you know the secret of 666. Next, we will build a historical timeline for these prophecies. We are now going to use our spectrum analysis to construct an historical timeline for these prophecies, using astronomical dating to verify their occurrences in history. For the sake of brevity, we are going to speed through this section rather quickly, as we have illustrated this process in detail in numerous other previous videos in this series. In verse 11, we have 2 astronomical references. The Lamb, with 2 horns, which is Aries, and the dragon, which was associated with the beast from the sea. When we look into the sky, we find there is the Lamb constellation Aries, and right next to it is the constellation known as Cetus, referred to as the sea beast. So this is our astronomical information for verse 11. In the geographical column we have the location of Jerusalem. In the historical column, we have the Eastern religious authority. In the symbolical column, we will make note of the dragon lamb motif in the text, and in the mathematical column, we have the two horns of the lamb, which is 1 plus 1, which equals 2. In verse 12, we have the phrase, "in the face of him," which is repeated in verse 14. And when we get to verse 18, speaking of the same entity, we have the phrase, "number of a man." Face of him, and man, are astronomical references to the constellation of Aquarius, the man. So we will put Aquarius in our astronomical column for verse 12. In our geographical column, we are still in the location of Jerusalem. In our historical column, this text is speaking about the location of what we know today to be the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In this text, we once again have a reference to the adoration of the crucifixion, which we know from the previous prophecy. So we will make a note of that in our symbolic column. In the mathematical column, we have the former beast, the face of him, and the former beast, which is 3, and completion, which is 7. That gives us 7 times 3 for a value of 21. In verse 13, John prophesies the fire from heaven, and mentions the phrase, "in the sight of men." This is once again a reference to the constellation Aquarius. In the geographical column, we are still in Jerusalem. In the historical column, we will note fire from heaven. In the symbolic column, because later in verse 16, John is prophesying the ash mark of the Azazel goat from Yom Kippur, we will make a note of the connection of fire to the ash mark, which is because of the ash, made from fire. There is a connection between the ash mark and the fire, we will note in the symbolic column. In the mathematical column, the number of fire is 5, and the phrase, "in the sight of men" indicates 10, because 10 was the number of a Jewish quorum of men. So 5 times 10 gives us the mathematical value of 50. In verse 14, John is still talking about the same event, so there is no additional time frame or new astronomical dates needed. So, we will just bring these values forward, but John does introduce the additional comment, that the fire from heaven miracle is actually a fraud or a deception, so we will make note of that in the symbolic column. In verse 15, John states that he gives the icon a powerful spirit, and the icon is that of the beast. Earlier this was identified as Aries and Cetus, so we will list that same reference for verse 15. In the geographical column, we are still in Jerusalem. In the historical column, we will note that this is a religious ritual of some kind. In the symbolic column we will make a note of idolatry, and in the mathematical column, we have the reference to the spirit given to the icon. This is the same spirit mentioned in Revelation chapter 16 verse 13, as the 3 unclean spirits, and the word icon is repeated 3 times. That gives us 3 times 3 for a value of 9. In verse 16, John brings up the mark. The astronomical constellation which represents the mark, is the only constellation that makes a mark, which is Scorpio. And also, John has already used the scorpion as a symbol for the Roman military, and the Inquisitions, in chapter 9, because of their crossbow weapon, called the Scorpio. But more specifically, this reference is to the tail of Scorpio known as Lambda Scorpii, or as it was known, in the ancient world, as the star Shaula. Geographically, we are still in Jerusalem. In the historical column, we have the description of a marking ritual. In the symbolic column, we have the ash mark of the Azazel goat. And in the mathematical column, we have the number 7 for completion of the mark, and the number 6 for the beast, which gives us 7 plus 6 for a value of 13. In verse 17, we have 2 astronomical references. John mentions no one is able to market or trade. The constellation this refers to is Libra, the scales, usually depicted as a symbol for justice, but they come from measuring weight scales, actually used in commerce. So we have the scales of the constellation Libra, and John mentions the mark, which is already examined, is a reference to the tail of Scorpio, known as Lambda Scorpii. In the geographical column, we are now in Rome. In the historical column, we have a reference to a legal code, also known as a codex, of some kind. In the symbolic column, we have economic control, and in the mathematical column, we have market, which is 2, we have trade, which is 2, and we have the mark, which is 6, the number, which is 6, and the name, which is 6. 2 plus 2 plus 6 plus 6 plus 6 gives us a mathematical value of 22. And finally in verse 18, we have 3 astronomical references. First we have pebbles. These were white stones. This reference is used repeatedly in Revelation for Jupiter, such as mentioned in chapter 2 verse 17. Secondly, we have the reference to the beast, which is a monarch. As you have also seen, for example, in chapter 12, and in chapter 10, John refers to Saturn as the crown, symbolic of royalty or a monarchy. And we have John's explicit reference to the number of a man, which is a very clear reference to Aquarius, the man. So astronomically in verse 18, we have Jupiter, Saturn and Aquarius. In the geographical column, we are in Rome. In the historical column, we have the coming of 666, or the third six, prophesied by John. In the symbolic column, we note the sign of the Antichrist, and in the mathematical column, because we are told to enumerate, meaning to count, we count 6 3 times, which gives us the number 3. Now that we have completed our spectrum analysis, we are able to construct our historical timeline, which begins in the year 312, from the previous prophecy. 312 AD plus 2 years, gives us the year 314 AD, for verse 11. 314 AD plus 21 years, gives us the year 335 AD for verse 12. 335 AD plus 50 years, gives us the year 385 AD for verse 13. Since verse 14 is still talking about the same event, we have the year 385 AD for verse 14 as well. 385 AD plus 9 years, gives us the year 394 AD for verse 15. In verse 16, we have the year 394 AD, plus 13 years, which gives us the year 407 AD. 407 AD plus 22 years, gives us the year 429 AD for verse 17. And the year 429 AD, plus 3 years, gives us the year 432 AD. And that completes our historical timeline for John's second prophecy, complete with astronomical dating. If all this were simply made up and concocted out of someone's imagination, there is no way all these events could line up exactly with John's astronomical dating of the heavens. But as you are going to see once again, every single detail of what John prophesied, even down to precise minute details, and verified by astronomical dating of the heavens, did in fact really happen, exactly as John prophesied it would. In the next video, we will begin the examination of the actual real historical fulfillment of John's prophecies in Revelation chapter 13 verses 11 through 18, and confirmed by astronomical dating for these events. In this video, you saw that the famous text labeled the second beast, in the King James Bible, is a prophecy of the rise of a subordinate religious monarch in Jerusalem, which will be responsible for a fraudulent miracle of fire from heaven, and the institutionalization of icon worship in the legal code of the Roman Empire. You also saw that John prophesied there would be coming a time of religious law, that would govern the rules of economy, and prohibit people outside of Rome's religious favor, from buying and selling. And that there would arise a succession of 3 monarchs by the name of 6. A 6th first, a 6th second and a 6th third, who would be the fulfillment of the prophecy of 666, and conclude John's prophecies in Revelation chapter 13. In the next video, you will see the amazing historical fulfillment of John's prophecies along with his astronomical dating, fulfilled in the most amazing minute details, written centuries before the events prophesied, occurred in real history. Don't miss the exciting historical fulfillment of John's second prophecy, from Revelation chapter 13, verses 11 through 18. You will be utterly shocked and amazed at what the counter-reformation has been intentionally hiding from the world, and how incredible John's prophecies really were in history. Thank you for watching.